Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Murtha, and I'm Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and International Research Cooperation, the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, and Director of the China Studies Program here at SAIS. Thank you very much for attending. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank Madeline Ross at China Studies, Josh White at the Asia Studies Program, and Joel Andreas at the East Asian Studies Program at the Krieger School of Johns Hopkins, as well as Sonia Holmes, Pedro Matias, and everyone else involved in making today's event possible. It is my genuine pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Becker. Ms. Becker is an American author and journalist who covered national and international affairs as a New York Times correspondent and was member of the staff that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. She was a senior foreign editor of National Public Radio, where she received 2 DuPont Columbia Awards as executive producer for reporting on South Africa's first democratic elections and the Rwandan genocide. And among other honors, she was the 2008 Edelman Fellow at Harvard's Sorensen Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School. She began her career as a war correspondent for the Washington Post covering Cambodia. Ms. Becker is the author of When the War Was Over, A Modern History of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, for which she won a Robert F. Kennedy book citation. The Financial Times said of her book that, quote, Becker writes history as history should be written, unquote. I couldn't agree more. She is also the author of the prescient Overbooked, The Exploding Business of Travel and Tourism, America's Vietnam War, A Narrative History for Young Adults, and Bopana, which is only available in Cambodia. Ms. Becker holds a degree in Indian Studies from and is a proud alum of the University of Washington, and she did language studies in Agra, India. I first met Elizabeth on the pages of the New York Times in 1986 in a review of When the War Was Over. And that winter break, during my senior year in college, snowed in somewhere in Lewiston, Maine. I devoured every single page of it. To this day, it remains the first book I recommend to anybody wanting to learn about the fascinating and extraordinarily complicated, yet often magical country of Cambodia. It has since become a genuine classic, combining exquisite writing, the highest of journalistic standards, and research so powerful that when I uncover something new in my own ongoing research on Cambodia, and then subsequently reread When the War Is Over, it turns out she knew it too. When the War Was Over reads as something even more compelling than simply a labor of love. It is written by a passionate eyewitness to and chronicler of some of the most wonderful and some of the most terrible events imaginable, as well as others that lie beyond our ability to comprehend. Written in a way that only somebody with real skin in the game can. Vivid, touching, vital. It also contains the germ for the book that Elizabeth will present today, You Don't Belong Here, How 3 Women Wrote the Story of War. Ms. Becker was herself one of a tiny group of young women embedded in what so many considered a man's game. At the time, and sadly even today. The swagger, the self-confidence, the fearlessness of journalists pursuing their chosen profession and in a war zone at a time when the rights of women in the workplace back home were seen as quaint and unimportant would seemingly have presented an insurmountable obstacle to any woman seeking to enter this boys' club. But as you will see today, some of the most important and enduring work on the Second Indochina War was written and photographed by women. You Don't Belong Here is a long overdue corrective that will also become an essential part of the canon. I could go on, but I won't, because I'm as eager as you are to listen to her. So I will ask you to please put your questions in the Q&A function and join me in warmly welcoming one of the most influential people in my own intellectual journey, someone I'm proud to call a friend and a fellow traveler, Ms. Elizabeth Becker.
Thank you, Andy. Very generous, and I especially appreciate this because today is the day of publication for the book. So it means a lot to have a friend and someone I admire tremendously welcoming to this event at SAIS. First slide, please. I want to tell you about Madeline is, thank you, Madeline. There, thank you. This is the cover of the book. And I want to introduce you first to the women, just so you know who I'm talking about. I wanted to have photographs because that'll keep the women straight in your minds, I hope, and also give you a sense of the era. This is the mid-60s. The United States has just joined the fully fighting the war in Vietnam, the American War from 1965 to 1965 to 75. And the first woman at the top is Catherine Leroy. She's French, raised outside of Paris. She was a woman who was a bit of a rebel, to put it mildly. She was an accomplished pianist who dropped out of high school, got bored, learned how to parachute, and in the process decided that she wanted to be a war photographer in Vietnam. Took a job in a crummy unemployment office in Paris, raised her money for a ticket, and arrived in Saigon. She had one Leica camera tied around her neck with a shoelace, and she was a bit of a figure of amusement for the press corps, thinking that she'd come and go in a few weeks and go back to Paris. Instead, she persevered. She hung in there, and by the time the war was over, she had made history. She was the first woman to ever win the George Polk Award for photography and the first woman to win the Robert Capa Gold Medal Award. She did this by changing the way you photograph war, and I'll tell you more about that. And as, yes, please, next photograph. No, I'm sorry. Go back. Okay, the next woman is Frances Fitzgerald in the middle. She's the one American. You'll notice that each woman is from a different continent. And that shows you, I think, a sense of how rare it was for women to go. They're very few. They came from very special places. Her name is Francie Fitzgerald, Frankie Fitzgerald, Frances. She's from a very prominent family, blue blood, elite, power brokers in the financial world and in politics, and wealthy. She's an honors graduate from Radcliffe who, when she wanted to become a journalist, was told by Newsweek that women were only qualified to be researchers, not writers. This is in the time when women could not have credit cards. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was at least a decade away from winning the first Supreme Court case on gender bias. So Frankie, with less problem buying that airplane ticket, flew to Saigon. And immediately she was dismissed for a very different reason by the press corps as just a dilettante, a former debutante. She was just gonna play around in journalism and then she'd go back to New York. She proved them wrong as well. And she showed that her background made her a little sharper about what the Americans were doing, a little smarter. And eventually she wrote the most honored book on the war before or since, Fire in the Lake, the Vietnamese and Americans in Vietnam. And she was a mere 31 years old when it was published. The bottom is Kate Webb, Australian. She came from an academic family. And a family of some importance. Her grandfather was the Archbishop of New Zealand. She graduated in philosophy and was in art school when she needed to make some extra money to pay off some debts. So she went to the Mirror newspaper in Sydney as what we would call a copy boy. She was, you carry news copy from one desk to the other. And in the process, she noticed that Australian soldiers were being sent to Vietnam to fight next to Americans. Now, there are only two countries who sent their soldiers to fight with the Americans, Australia and South Korea. Europeans would have nothing to do with it. They thought it was a mistake. So Kate, very an intellectual sharp as Frankie was, Frankie is, she said, okay, I'm gonna go to Vietnam. Again, no job, bought her own ticket and landed there about 10 months after the first two. She ended up by war's end to become one of the best combat reporters ever, and the first woman to be a bureau chief in a combat zone. That's a position of leadership that pre-Vietnam you'd never imagine a woman in. And like Katrine and Frankie, Kate was singular in her concern about the war and the people who had to live it, i.e. the Cambodians, the Vietnamese, and the Laotians. By the end of her career and her death, she was so renowned for that kind of concern that a prestigious journalism award is named after her, the Kate Webb Prize, given every year to the Asian journalist who showed the most courage in covering difficult situations. Next slide, please. Okay, let's zero in on Katrine first. As you can see, she's barely 5 feet tall. These are normal Americans, and she looks like a little boy in a costume. She rarely could keep on enough weight to weigh 100 pounds. By now she has her camera around her neck. It's a real one. That she has a strap. She doesn't have to worry about it. She got around the men by spending as much time as possible in the battlefield, usually the only reporter, no other photographer. She spent a lot of time in the battlefield. That's where she learned her English. And it was Marines English, so it was a bit coarse. And she said, fuck you, in a Parisian accent that everybody loved to hear her say. But she was serious, and she learned her craft by herself, taking these photographs. And it was distinctive. It was intimate, it was courageous. And what I'm gonna do is try to show you some examples, because it's easier to show you the photographs than to try to describe it. Next photograph, please. Here she is. Remember I told you for fun, she had become a parachutist? Well, she used it to her advantage. She was almost drowning in that parachute. She's the only reporter, that means the only journalist, no other journalist, photographer, or writer allowed to be in the airborne assault in Vietnam. Next photograph, please. This is one of her pictures. It almost looks like a ballet. She's jumping with them. The whole series is to die for. That's not the right words, I think. Great photographs. The assault was a wash, so it was not only the first assault, but the last. But she had her exclusive, and this is the beginning of her rise to fame and the resentment of some of her colleagues, which I go into quite a bit of a detail in the book. Next, please. So I'm going to show you just 4 photographs to show you an example of what is very intimate. She got very close to the subjects. Tiny, she used her size to great advantage. Very small, very athletic. She got very close because she thought she had to be able to catch the eyes, to catch the face, to catch the emotion. These are Marines trying to save a comrade in the middle of battle. She's right there. And you could see the face, the anguish in the one Marine, and then the comrade who sadly dies. Next, please. This became an iconic photo of the war. This is in the middle of a harsh, tough battle. Mortars going off everywhere. Katrine is so small and so close, this man does not know that she's there. He's a medic, 20 years old, trying to save a comrade who he just discovers is dead, and he's screaming out loud. Again, this is a series that was printed in Life and Look and everywhere, to the point where one bureau chief wrote back, why does this 100-pound French photographer, a French girl, I'm sure he called it girl, I can't remember, get a photo like that and we don't? Next slide, please. And here is a very wonderful portrait of waiting for the war. And she captures these expressions that soon became a singular kind of way, Katrine's way. Next, please. And the civilians. Many amazing photographs of civilians. She made her name in Tet in all kinds of battles where she was able to capture those photographs. Next, please. And I wanted to, to say that there are a lot of heroes here too, and this is one of the best. His name, the man in the middle, is Horst Voss. He is a German photographer. He'd already won a Pulitzer by the time he met Catherine Lois. He was not only a great photographer, he was the manager for photography of the Associated Press for the war, running it out of Saigon. And he was unusual because he decided as bureau chief, he would buy photographs from anyone who could take a good photograph. He would buy the photograph no matter who took it, even women. So when Catherine shows up and says she wants to be a photographer, at first he laughs, but he says, okay. He gave her a shot. He gave her some film and he said, go ahead, I'll see what you can do. And he became one of her biggest boosters, which is like having, the Pope of all photography behind you as a mentor. And he said she took photographs he had not seen, except perhaps in World War II by some of the most perceptive. Next, please. Now this is Frances Fitzgerald. As I said, she arrived in Saigon with people knowing that her father was in the top of CIA and knowing she had friends in the embassy. And just, as I said, presuming that she'd just write a couple of pieces because she had great sources in the embassy and go back home. She did the opposite. She almost avoided the embassy. She arrived with a deeper skepticism about the basic fundamental reasons for the war than just about any other reporter there. And I don't think I'm exaggerating, but because she grew up among the elite. Her dad was in the CIA, her mother was the known mistress of Adlai Stevenson. And she knew you had to look deeper and not just at whether the strategy was working or whether the outcome was what the Americans wanted to be. So she actually traveled around looking at the end of a battle, for instance. She would, instead of going back to Saigon and writing a piece, she would go to a civilian hospital and see how the Vietnamese civilians were being treated, how the wounded were being treated. And it was ghastly. Vietnamese soldiers had decent treatment, but not the civilians. She examined Saigon for how they were treating the refugees from the battlefield. And the more she did this, the more she developed the big question. What is the United States doing in Vietnam from the Vietnamese point of view? The Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese history, the Vietnamese culture, where does it fit in? What was going on with the French, and before that with the history, with the Chinese? Questions that no other reporters even, they thought this was way off the mark. One colleague said she put the foreign in foreign correspondent because she actually wanted to know what the war meant to Vietnam. She went back to the United States and, oh, excuse me, next please. This is her press card. I wanted to show it because it's so rare to see a press card where, say, 1,000 reporters are registered that year for press in MACV, the military headquarters, and there you go through a whole bunch and there's all men, and there's Frankie. Anyway, she went back and wrote Fire in the Lake, and it was a surprise, deeply felt, meaningful examination of that question. What is the Vietnamese history here? What is the political meaning here? And not only was it rare for a journalist to ask the question, as it turned out, it was rare for, and even in the world of academics. John King Fairbanks, who as you may know, is the grandfather of all things Chinese studies in the United States and even Asian studies. And he said that the Pearl Harbor of American academia was the lack of real understanding of Vietnam during the war. And so Frankie just tried to answer that question. It didn't help that her book came out the same year as Best and the Brightest, which you may know about. It was the magnum opus of David Halberstam, Pulitzer Prize winning American correspondent in Vietnam during the Kennedy period. Much, rightfully so, much beloved. And he thought his book, Best and the Brightest, about the American decision makers would sweep the field in 1972. And he and all of her colleagues, the men back in Vietnam, were shocked that Frankie's book did. And as I said, the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, and the Bancroft History Award. She suffered for that. If you look up critiques of Fire in the Lake, you'll see how. Next, please. As I said, she came in 66. This is 1973. She kept coming back. All three women were devoted to this story. And here she is, right after the Paris Peace Accords are signed, reporting from the communist side in South Vietnam, the PRG, the Viet Cong, many names, NLF. And she did not give up devotion to that story, to the point that in January 1975, she got a rare visa to Hanoi. And she did a wonderful job in New Yorker series. She didn't realize that while she was there, the North Vietnamese were sending their troops down for the final offensive that would lead to their victory in Saigon. She did suspect something very important because nobody in the military would talk to her. Well, anyway, next slide, please. Now this is Kate. You saw her at the beginning. Kate, as I said, she had a hard time getting a job. She's Australian, so it didn't help. She could not get anybody to even give her assignments as a freelancer. And she almost gave up and went back home until an American woman who was an editor of an alternative GI newspaper said, okay, Kate, I'll give you some assignments. Here's the authority you need to get a press credential. And she was able to stay on and gradually scrap together work. She'd take anything, what's called hometowners, where you go and do an interview with some guys from Omaha for the Omaha newspaper. She showed her real chops in January 1968. That was the Tet Offensive, Tet, Lunar New Year, Vietnam. That was the offensive that really was a turning point, a major turning point for the war. Kate was up at 4. She was thinking of going to play coup and noticed that some military jeeps were whizzing by her. She got a taxi, followed them, and lo and behold, the North Vietnamese had invaded, a very small group, the US Embassy, which was astonishing because just a month or two earlier, the American leaders had said, light is at the end of the tunnel, we're close to winning. And instead, the embassy was under siege. She did tremendous reporting, which led to her being hired as a local hire for the United Press International wire service. And one of her first dispatches, she coined the phrase that the embassy looked like a butcher shop in Eden. And you'll see that in all kinds of magazine stories and all kinds of books. And that was the beginning of her great career. Next, please. She became a war correspondent. Very good. Unlike Frankie and Katrine, she hung out with the guys. She was one of the boys. You can see she cut her hair very short, always in jeans, she'd go out for a couple of drinks and then go home and read philosophy books. I'm not kidding. But she did not try to distinguish herself in any way like a woman. In fact, she despised women's liberation. She thought it would demean her. She did not like to be called a woman reporter because she thought that implied a lesser category. And, and for a while it worked. She was so good that in 1970, when the United States expanded the war to Cambodia, she was named the #2 for the new Phnom Penh Bureau. Now, the 1970 invasion of Cambodia was a shock to the United States. It led to the biggest demonstrations, I think, still against something. You may remember that the May 1968 at Kent State demonstration led to National Guards killing some of the students. Richard Nixon had to defend this because he had won his 1968 election promising to get out of the war and said he was expanding it. And he sent the American troops in, but Congress reacted furiously and they left soon thereafter. By the beginning of July, they were almost all gone. And that left a very inexperienced Cambodian army to fend off the North Vietnamese who had followed the Americans. I won't go into this too much, but it was expanding a war on both sides. So the journalists show up and it's a mess. There are no clear front lines. There are no military helicopters, American military helicopters to ferry them around. No American military hospitals to take care of them. They were pretty much on their own. And it proved to be the most dangerous place during the entire 10 years of the war. Within the first 4 months of the Cambodia campaign, as many journalists were killed in the battlefield as were killed during the previous 6 years in Vietnam. And one of those killed was Kate's boss, the bureau chief in Phnom Penh. So UPI did what was rational, but was still historic. They named Kate to replace him. It was, in those days, it was insanely historic because to name a woman to be the head of a bureau in the middle of this insane war was unheard of. And she did brilliantly. Her pieces were shown. They were wonderful. And she became one of the most important reporters of the Indochina War at that time. But her luck ran out too. And the year later, she was captured by the North Vietnamese in eastern Cambodia and held for 23 days. Again, not many women found themselves in that situation. She was with one Japanese reporter and 4 Cambodians. They survived, but nobody knew what was going on. And there was no torture, there was no rape, but it was tough. The same miserable food that the North Vietnamese soldiers ate. They didn't have good medical care. In Kate's, later she wrote about it and she called the MASH. She wishes that something from MASH would show up because her feet were bleeding, so on and so forth. And while all this was going on, she was declared dead. And the New York Times wrote an obit of her. That's how visible this whole affair was. Everybody's watching what's going to happen to Kate Webb. Well, she came out alive. And that was the beginning of the Kate Webb legend that those of us back home in the United States were watching very carefully. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite because Kate's so happy. She's back in Sydney visiting her family, and her brother, who she's looking at, takes her as a guest to the Correspondence Club in Sydney, which is men only, which all of them were in those days. And she crashed and nobody dared ask the Kate Webb to leave this club. And it's the beginning of her acknowledging that, well, maybe as a woman, things are a little different. And this is the woman that I followed, that many of us followed. There are testimonies from the few women who then went on for the rest of the war to say, if Kate Webb hadn't written those stories, I don't think I could have convinced my editor to do this. In fact, after Kate Webb, the New York Times finally sent a woman reporter to Vietnam, Gloria Emerson. Next slide, please. And so that's me. I followed her. In fact, through a mutual friend, Kate met me at the airport in Hong Kong to make sure I caught the right plane to Phnom Penh. She was already in Hong Kong, having her bosses telling her that she needed to recover from the war. They didn't use the word PTSD. Nobody knew what that was, but they knew that she needed to stay out of the war for a while. Next slide, please. And this is what the Cambodian press corps looked like. Not a lot. There are a lot of Cambodians. I'm with the man immediately in front of me is the former Prime Minister Long Barrett, who would later be killed by the Khmer Rouge. Next slide, please. And this is the Cambodian War. Monks in front of a tank. Cambodia had been neutral for so long through all of the throughout the independence, let me be precise. From 55 to 70, their leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, had managed to stay neutral in the war, to play one side against the other for favors, even though he was surrounded by war. Vietnam to one side, Thailand to the other, Laos to the north, and the incursion, the spreading of the war was catastrophic for that country. Next slide, please. And this is what we saw all the time. Little kids, soldiers, not just little kid soldiers, all soldiers with rubber sandals. It was, well, that's another story, but we all have these women to thank for what happened. Next slide, please. In this book, to tell that story, I tell their whole lives. I don't just talk about the professional. I tell the story of Vietnam, the whole war, so that you don't have to know the war to read this book. In fact, I'd like you to read this book and say, oh, okay, I don't have to read another book about Vietnam because I can see it through the eyes of these women. I tell you about their romantic life. You know, as women, their colleagues were much more interested in their romantic life than in their professional life. And they had to learn how to protect themselves. And you see what they had to do that. The excitement, the romances, the obstacles, and also the unheard of successes they had. Just these three women, what they did, the mark they've left on history. And as a narrator, I thought, well, it was also personal too, because I was worried we were running out of time. It'd been so long since the war ended, and these women were getting lost. I remember people saying, you were in the war? I didn't know women covered. And they said, oh, Cambodia, that wasn't the Vietnam War. I mean, it was, and I said, don't you know any women? Can't you tell me any women who covered the war? And the answer was always a blank no. People knew about Martha Gellhorn in World War II. They knew about Lee Hamilton, the photographer in World War II. Maybe Susan Meisalas in Central America after us. And then in the Gulf War, Christiane Amanpour. They did not realize that these women not only, well, these women broke through the thickest of glass ceilings, because after Vietnam, the US military completely dropped their ban on women in the battlefield. After Vietnam, media organizations accepted that staff members could be sent as foreign correspondents and to war. And it's because of these women. And so that's sort of, time is running out. Two of these women are dead. Frankie went on to have a wonderful career. She recently won a special award from the Historical Society for her lifetime achievement. And I wanted to write a book so that she could see that we all appreciated what she did, and that your generations will know that these women were there. They changed how you look at war, and they were also sort of an example for women to know what they've been through, for journalists to know what their history was, and looking back again at Vietnam. Thank you, Andy. That's it.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So while we collect some questions, what I wanted to do is ask you kind of a few questions or make a few observations. I don't know, and I don't think we're going to have time for you to be able to answer, all of them. So, please pick and choose, as you see fit. I guess first thing I want to start with is an observation. I don't want to, create any kind of sense of false equivalence. But I see a lot of, when I was in the field doing my dissertation research, I was in a very, very enviable position in that I was far from Beijing, I was far from other foreigners, and I was really, embedded, quite literally. I lived in a apartment complex for retired party cadres. And it was a great position, to work outward from, but it was extraordinarily lonely. It was extremely, you were far removed from, on several different levels from, a whether you want to call it a support group or just, a peer group or what have you. And, and that was in peacetime, and, and I was in a relatively privileged position within kind of this appellation being a foreigner. So I cannot imagine the kind of strength and, that it took to be, to be able to do this, for any of them. Just a couple quick questions, if I could, and I see the questions are starting to come in. The first is what was really interesting in the book, and you didn't really mention it as much in the presentation, and I should say that I just got the book at 2 p.m. today, and I'm already 2 chapters in, and it is, I cannot wait to pick it up again and to continue. So maybe the answer is, is somewhere down, down the road. But what was really interesting is that it seems that these 3 journalists, so one of the themes here is this sense of professionalism, of how you learn your craft and how you undertake it, and you don't worry about the things that you probably should be worrying about in a perfect world, because it's about getting the photograph, getting the story right, and the other thing is that, so it's a sense of professionalism. The other thing that's really, really interesting, especially in the era that we live in, is just how different the politics were of these 3 women. So Catherine Leroy was very much a French, took a French patriotic view, at least up through
When she
chapter
arrived,
2.
yeah.
And, whereas I don't know where Frances Fitzgerald came in, but she seemed to be, a bit of an iconoclast given where she came from. And then Kate Webb didn't have any, time for, the empowering movements at the time. So yeah. I found it striking that we're not just talking about one kind of political caste or class here. I mean, we're really, really run the gamut. It's a really great kind of variation of experiences, and yet the the work speaks for itself.
No, and that was there were so many moments I could believe the richness of these stories. That Katrine starts from the what we would call Le Pen today, and she ends up her last big essay, photo essay, was to say, I don't think that people like either side particularly, and maybe 20% on one side, 20% on the other, and the 60% in the middle just want to get on with their lives, which is a huge thing for her to say. So you're right. It's very rich, the differences.
Yeah, yeah. I'm cognizant of time, so I'm gonna, what I'll do is I'll just set a marker here if I can, Elizabeth, that any remaining questions that I have, we'll have to pursue those over lunch or dinner,
Absolutely.
Or both. And what I'll do then is I'll start bringing in some of our questions from people in the audience. So, so the first comes from David Furman. And I'm just going to read the question. Curious what your thoughts are about Dickie Chappelle, perhaps the best known of all women war correspondents / photographers in Vietnam. Did you ever consider her as a possible subject? And of course,
I write about her, and she's well known for dying there. And her great work was before. She was a great photographer, but within months of arriving in Vietnam, she was killed on patrol with the Marines. And in fact, the picture of her crumpled up on the battlefield was sent around the world, and it was used by a lot of photo agencies to say they don't want any more women on the battlefield. So yes, she's great, but she's not within that Vietnam specter per se.
Great, thank you. I'm working with 3 screens, and I get a workout just moving my mouse to the unmute button. A second question that we have is a couple of questions from Dworkin, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine them. Did any of these correspondents go to Laos? And when you were in country, did you ever make it to Laos as well? Because it's always the forgotten.
Yeah, it's the one. Yeah, no. The problem with Laos, I went to Laos, yes, to help when the prisoners of war, the American prisoners of war, released, and some came through Laos. But Laos was a place where there was very little support for news. So if you were a freelancer, you would more or less starve to death there. People, and there's Fred Bramfman, famously as an aide, USAID kind of guy, did amazing reporter as an aid fellow that then led to other reports. But no.
Okay, let's see, from Jan Barris from the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Were other countries better than we were about posting female correspondents to the front? A friend of mine is the daughter of the Australian war correspondent Dennis Warner and his wife Peggy. And I know that Peggy wrote books about the war, though she may not be sure if she actually covered the war itself.
Mm-hmm. It was pretty much the same. For instance, Kate, the Australians would not let Kate close to them in Vietnam. They were not as good. So that's the military side. On the media side, most of the women who wanted to cover the wars, their military would assign them to the rear with the nurses, so that their women, of course, figured out how to get around it, but the rule was you're with the nurses, you're in the rear guard, and that's pretty universal. What's different is the wars that are not central, but like a lot of women would make their name in Greece, and those kinds of battlefields. But was there one country that was better at sending women? I don't think so.
So Hiram Woodward asks, curious if you ever encountered Roxana Brown. I think her career as a reporter was not long. She subsequently became an art historian of ceramics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's such a sad story. I don't know if you know this, but Roxanne was just a delightful woman. She came through Cambodia on her way. She was learning ceramics, and I met her because she was working with Bernard-Philippe Grolier, who was at the, Grolier, the Angkor Conservatoire, and she went on to Bangkok, and we quite a name for herself. And somehow, some public prosecutor in the Northwest said she was somehow involved with, one of those creepy antiquities. And she was arrested when she arrived in SeaTac in Seattle, put in prison and not given the medical treatment she needed. And within 2 days, she was dead. It's one of the saddest stories.
And when was that? Because I know that is
like 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know.
Okay.
But
yeah,
this century, definitely.
Right. That's an issue that still has legs, and it's still, it's still ongoing. So that's.
It's we will never forget that.
One question I have is, was, one of the themes of more soldiers than people who covered the war was, what it was like to come back home. And I'm wondering, was there a kind of a common or unique experience, among women correspondents about coming back and, facing the kind, things were not, it took a while for things to, evolve here as well as in the field.
Right.
Was that an extra burden, or was that?
No, that's completely insightful, because Katrine is the most obvious. So she's suffering very badly from all those years covering the war. So, I mean, she wrote poetically almost about her PTSD without knowing that she was describing PTSD. When she goes back to Paris, she can't bear any discussion of the war. She leaves dinner parties. She doesn't know what's wrong with herself. She walks across the street against the wrong light, the whole number. And she accepts an assignment to New York for a music festival that's called Woodstock. And that's sort of the beginning of her figuring out how she's going to deal with it. I'm not saying she recovers, but at Woodstock, she just, oh boy, these are my people. She drops her camera. She finds the Vietnam vets. She hangs with them. There's a long story. She ends up doing a documentary about Ron Kovich, You have to read the book.
Oh, that's good. And I surely will. That was one of the questions I did have about PTSD. Or rather, I mean, I had another question about PTSD, but that was, you cover that as well. Were there political consequences of what these correspondents did when they came home as well, or were they? I mean, what was the anti-war movement in their respective countries? How might that have? Because I haven't gotten to that yet.
The political dimensions, I would say, were more likely in the field, so that when you wrote something, if it was contrary to what the U.S. Embassy liked, you were. Maybe you're an ideologue, maybe you're part of the anti-war, et cetera, et cetera. And if your colleagues would question, whether or not. And it also, this is not one of the three women, but my colleague Silvana Foa, who was United Press International, she wrote one of the most decisive pieces about US Embassy illegally directing bombing in Cambodia in '73. She was thrown out of the country permanently for that story. Thrown out. US Embassy was furious. Within a week or so, Sidney Schamberg of the New York Times wrote almost the same story. No consequences whatsoever. And he doesn't even acknowledge that Silvana had written it first. So there's all kinds of dimensions. And so, like in Frankie's case, her consequence was when her book comes out and the grumbling starts and saying, oh, well, she got the good reviews because the anti-war crowd likes it. And, oh, well, she over-relied on Paul Muse, the anti-war guy. And, in fact, it was so much that I interviewed Frederic Logeval at Harvard. to say, ask her, okay, give me the lowdown. What is going on here? And he said, well, listen, it was a seminal book. There's no question, ultimate importance, period. Of course, later, after 72, of course you learn more. You know what the archives are like. That's normal, that's history. And he sees a lot of the grumbling and the archness as jealousy, envy, and maybe misogyny.
And that, having spent 10 years teaching at Cornell, which was the epicenter for a lot of this,
Yeah.
the politics of covering the war.
Yeah.
This was something that could end careers. This was something that was, it wasn't just an intellectual debate, over Chardonnay. It was,
No.
it was roll up your sleeves, and it was a blood sport. I have another question from Hosta Coleman, PhD student here at SAIS. I have yet to read the book, but I'm curious about whether or not the women reporters were able to speak to Vietnamese women more easily.
First of all, people didn't speak to Vietnamese women much at all. And Frankie, and a lot of the women didn't want to do stories about women because then they'd be typecast. So you want to break away that. But Frankie, in her iconoclastic way, said she figured out what you all know nowadays, but wasn't figured. She did a huge piece in Vogue magazine about Vietnamese women who actually run the economy. Oh my God, women running the economy. You would not find that anyplace else, when of course, they do. And most of the, so yes, but they did have it easier. And all of them said that. But on the other hand, did the men try? I couldn't figure out, because there was very little interest in interviewing women other than Madame New.
It was anything but representative.
Right. Yeah, right. So yes, there's no question. And Kate would say that it helped with men too, to be a woman. Here's, there's no denying, oh my gosh, an attractive woman, Western woman. I'll talk to her. So, they don't hide from that. They know that's the case. Yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. I have a question that's more contemporary. And this is a second year China Studies concentrator, Josh Cartwright. As a journalist, what do you think of the state of journalism today, as well as the empowerment of women in the field? I'm assuming in the field of journalism, but you could take it as wide as you'd like.
Well, as you know, the last 4 years of having someone in the White House who called it the fake press has been damaging beyond belief. And that's a page right out of every dictator or autocrat. And it had a huge effect on everything. And it echoed around the world. That, I think, has created a sense among journalists that we have to be more comrade. We have to cooperate together. We're not just a profession, we are protecting the First Amendment. And I think all of you should remember that. You can get mad at what we write, but we are protecting the First Amendment. And that's become, people have, just like we've learned to appreciate all the stuff we took for granted, same with journalists. We have to band together, so on and so forth. On the other hand, our economic system is undermining journalism. And from Australia to all the hedge funds who are trying to underdo local journalism, it's scary. It's very scary. I
knew this question was going to come up.
Okay.
It comes from my friend Tom Gold, who's professor emeritus of sociology out of Berkeley.
Okay.
And this is less to do with this book, but well, I'll just ask the question. Can Elizabeth talk about her experience nearly being killed by the Khmer Rouge? And have you been back to Cambodia, and what has that been like?
In brief, when I came back from the war, I couldn't forget Cambodia, just like everybody else. I mean, we all have that in common. And So I applied for a visa to Democratic Kampuchea. At the very end of the regime, we didn't know how close I got there with another American reporter, Richard Dudman, 2 weeks. It was like the committee of the Red Cross going to a concentration camp kind of thing. The last day, we interviewed Pol Pot, Dudman and I. A professor was with us, interviewed him so separately. We go to bed, so happy we're going to get in the plane the next day, and we're attacked at the guest house by a Cambodian gunman. He points his pistol at me. I scream no in my brilliant Khmer and run to the bathtub and hide there. I hear him run upstairs to where the men are. I hear gunshots, and then for several hours, no one comes for us. We're in Khmer Rouge land, no telephones, nothing. We had no idea what was going to happen. Then finally, the top guy at the foreign ministry came and got us, and we left the next day with Malcolm Caldwell's body in a coffin. They had murdered the professor. Yes, I go back all the time. I get back on the horse.
Yeah, I think once once you get the bug, it's really difficult to.
Yeah. Talk to my husband.
We have time at least for one more, and I'm going to go back to Joshua Cartwright because this is. I think this goes back to kind of the larger question of what advice would you have for those of us in early stages of our own journalism careers? And what might the experiences that you document in You Don't Belong Here? What lessons are there to take off or to avoid?
The world is so different now. My fear for foreign correspondenting is that there are too many freelancers. And as I said, the economics are not great. So all the organizations that used to, very few send out staff correspondents with health insurance and the right equipment and all that sort of stuff. So and the wars are so much, they go after journalists. We're targets now. So I would want them to be very wise, but then I'm a grandmother. I have a different attitude towards these things now. I would suggest the best way to get going would be, I know they're going to hate this, is local news. It's such a good beginning. Local news, and then jump to what you want, but you need that building block. My 2 years going back to the Post, the Washington Post, and spending 2 years on local news has carried me through. The tourism book you're talking about, I relied so much on what I learned from local news, covering local news.
That's really great advice, and I wouldn't have thought that. Shows what I know. But I guess what I would ask you is kind of last question that I have or see here is what lesson about not simply journalism, but just about learning, understanding, and kind of whether it's scholarship, whether it's journalism, this idea of learning about something that we don't know about, and that we need, that we have imperfect information on. Do the stories of these three journalists, do they give us not necessarily a roadmap, but what are the kinds of qualities that just, if you'll indulge me, I remember one of my mentors was the China scholar Mike Oxenberg. And I remember him telling me that the people who tend to succeed are not necessarily the people who are the absolute smartest, and so I was relieved when I heard that. But then I said, well, what is it that, he said, well, you have to have, a certain amount of gray matter. It's the people who can withstand discomfort, with a high pain threshold, with people who are dogged. And I found that to be some of the best advice, I've ever gotten, in the career of being a professor, who, yes, inordinately depends on field work. But are there things that emerge from the experiences from these three journalists that you'd want to leave everybody here with as?
Well, besides what you said, absolutely. And then second thing I would say is don't make something exotic. Avoid exotic. And that's what all three of these women did. They did not see Cambodians exotic or Vietnamese or anything else. They saw them for their full humanity. They wanted to know the culture. They wanted to get inside their skins. And I think that's what I learned a lot from my early years. Do not do exotic.
I think that's as good a note to end on as I can think of. Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time out. Congratulations. Everybody go out. I don't know if people can see this, but go out and buy a copy. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. And I'm really looking forward to being able to see you again soon.
Well, come to Washington. That's all you have to do.
I'll be there next week, so I'll shoot you an email.
Okay, and I want to thank you and Seiss and Madeline and Sonia and Pedro for doing this for me. And as I said, it's really fun that it was the first day of publication. It means a lot. And thank you, Andy, for all your support.
It does for us as well. Thanks,
okay,
Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, everybody else, for being here, and we'll see you all soon.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.